All right, appreciate everybody being here this evening. Let's take our Bibles and we will go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Second Corinthians chapter 10. We covered the first part of this chapter last week. We really covered two main thoughts. Of course, in the first section here, Paul speaks of the weapons of our warfare, that they're spiritual. Paul had been accused of being manipulative in his actions, right? Here's a guy that's, he's real bold with the pen. He's real strong. He's real forceful in a letter. But when he comes, they said that he's weak. They said that he's pitiful. There's a thought there that, maybe Paul was a manipulator. And Paul declared, no, that's not how we fight. We don't use carnal, fleshly means in our warfare. Our warfare is spiritual, and so we use spiritual weapons. Those weapons are strong. They're mighty. God's able to pull down strongholds through those weapons. Our goal is to always bring every thought into subjection to Christ. So he focused on that there for a while. And then, as he dealt with the accusation that Paul, he's bold with a pen, he's weak in person, and he dealt with accusations from some there in Corinth, he began to talk about the real measuring stick. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, ministry measuring sticks. Because the first thing that he mentioned to them was that, you like to look on the appearance. He noted that in verse number 7. Do you look on the things after the outward appearance? Is that really how we're going to do this? I mean, have we not learned anything? Of course, from the Scripture, we've learned already how foolish it is to judge things on the outward appearance. That's told to us long ago, right? That it's man that looketh on the outward appearance. It's the Lord that looketh upon the heart. Looking on the appearance will get you a Saul as king. Looking on the heart will get you a David as king. Obviously, one is better than the other. And then he took to verse 12, where we finished up last week, and he also said, and we dare not compare ourselves among ourselves. If we are looking for commendation, if we are looking for justification or for authentication of our ministry and of our service, we are not the measuring stick. We don't measure against each other. Okay? We are not successes or failures in the ministry and in the service of Christ. We don't find that by measuring ourselves against each other. He's going to elaborate on that more tonight. Because tonight we're going to learn what the standard of measurement is, both of Paul's apostleship as he defends that, but then we can also look at our own service. We can look at our own ministry, look at our church and what we're doing here. Number one, let's look here as we begin in verse number 13. We're going to look at the measuring stick that Paul would boast of. Paul's boast. Verse number 13. Well, let's read verse 12 because it kind of lays the foundation, our context. We finished with verse 12. For we dare not make ourselves of the number or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves. How did they commend themselves? They measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves are not wise. We're not doing that. We're not comparing ourselves among ourselves. Verse 13. But we will not boast of things without our measure, but according to the measure of the rule which God hath distributed to us, a measure to reach even unto you. The first thing that Paul notes, if we're going to talk about commendation, if we're going to talk about authentication, if we're going to talk about a measuring stick, a way to justify whether it's his apostleship, whether it's our ministry, if we're going to determine what's a success versus what's a failure, the first thing he says in verse 13 is that we will not boast of things without our measure. First thing is he confirms that he's going to confine his remarks to his own sphere of influence. Now, it's a popular phrase today, and I'm sure you've heard it. If you've watched TikToks or videos on the internet, or, people that are insulting each other or whatever, right? Stay in your lane, right? That's kind of the warning to everybody. If someone's getting in your business, if someone is imposing upon you, hey, look, buddy, you stay in your lane and I'll stay in mine. And that's what Paul is saying in verse number 13. I'm going to stay in my lane. He says, we will not boast of things without our measure, but according to the measure of the rule which God hath distributed unto us. If Paul's going to boast, he's going to make sure that he does not intrude into someone else's work. He's going to confine his thoughts to the sphere of influence that God gave him. Our measure, what we have been given, not things that are without our measure. The ministry would be better, it would be more successful if people would quit comparing themselves against everyone else. Paul, would you look at Paul as a failure? Because, Peter preached on the day of Pentecost and 3,000 people were saved. Paul never had that. That would be silly, wouldn't it? Guess who never preached on the day of Pentecost? Paul didn't. Guess who wasn't an apostle to the Jews? Paul wasn't. I mean, if you're going to stack the apostle Peter up as the measuring stick, Paul's like, no, that's not my sphere. That wasn't my realm. I'm not going to dabble in those things. We are not going to compare ourselves. We are not going to judge our ministry based on things that are without our sphere or our scope of influence. We have to be careful about that stuff, right? What we are going to consider successful, and we're a small group here. We're just, in the very real sense, we're just getting started. There's a small number of us. We are not and we cannot measure success based on, this is what the church up the road does. This is what the church up the road has. That Paul's like, no, we're not doing that. I'm going to confine my thoughts. We will not boast of things without our measure. Okay? I'm not going to dabble in the what ifs. I'm not going to get into what everyone else is doing. I'm not going to get into what other churches are doing or any other person's sphere of influence. We will not boast on those things without our measure. Here's what we will. According to the measure of the rule which God hath distributed to us. We have got to keep our nose in our own work. There is enough work for every minister, for every servant of Christ, for every church. There is enough work for them to do in their own sphere of influence without worrying about what every other church up the road is doing and trying to measure and coin success by comparing ourselves to those things. That is not what we are here for. We are not here to mimic what everyone else is doing. We are here because we feel that there is a work to do for the Lord in this community. They are not going to be our standard of practice. They're not going to be our standard of ethics. And because they're not our standard of belief or doctrine or practice, why would we make them our mark of success? If the church is up the road, if they don't believe what we believe and they don't practice what we practice, why would we get involved in comparing ourselves with them? They have all this much money and they have this amount of people, and until we equal that in this community, we're just not as successful. We must just not be doing something right. We're going to confine our measuring stick to the focus and the sphere, the job that God has given us. We cannot worry about the job that God didn't give us. We can't focus on that. Okay? God has us here in Cottleville and for a specific purpose. We have much to focus on. That's where we're going to confine our thoughts. We got to quit worrying about all that other stuff. That's good. A good reminder there from Paul about that. Verse number 14, for we stretch not ourselves beyond our measure, as though we reach not unto you. For we are come as far as to you also in preaching the gospel of Christ, Now, to those that would accuse Paul of overstepping his bounds, those that would accuse Paul of overstepping his authority, who does Paul think he is? And he writes these mean letters, and I don't even know, where does he get off thinking he has that kind of authority? Well, here's what Paul would say: my boasting is not out of line, because don't act like we didn't come there. Don't act like you aren't part of that sphere of influence. Corinth and the accusers of Paul and those that had come after him and had questioned his authority and had questioned his apostleship, Paul's like, listen, I'm just going to talk to you about my sphere of influence. I'm not going to worry about others. I'm not going to get into other churches or other ministers. Let me talk about my sphere of influence. But don't act like I didn't come as far as Corinth. Don't act like I didn't come there and preach the gospel. Don't act like I'm going beyond my bounds. Verse 14, we stretch not ourselves beyond our measure. Paul said, I'm not out of bounds here, okay? When I tell you in verse 13, I'm going to keep things within my circle, within my sphere, you're part of that. I came to Corinth. Paul came to Corinth and built a church there and preached the gospel to them that were there, had a great influence, had a great ministry when he was there. We can read about it. We kind of did a little bit in the introduction. You read through the book of Acts, you read about the year and a half that Paul spent in that region. And Paul's like, listen, even if I just keep my thoughts to my own sphere of influence, that includes you. That includes you, Corinth. I'm not overstepping my bounds. I'm not going beyond my measure. We are come as far as to you also in preaching the gospel of Christ. Paul, we would look at it outside of the context of just the church at Corinth, and we would look back and we would look at Paul as an apostle commissioned by Christ and say, yes, that Paul had apostolic authority. Paul would even narrow it so far down, though, as to say, if I limited my sphere, if I limited my words to only the sphere of places that I have been and had influence, I would still have authority in this situation. I came to you, brought you the gospel. Now, verse 15, he says, not boasting of things without our measure, that is, of other men's labors. Now, Paul is not going to boast of matters that are beyond his own personal service. This appeared to be a problem at the church at Corinth. Now, whether it was the Judaizers or these others that had come in that would often steal Paul's sheep, assassinate his character, they would contradict his teaching. And Paul says that's not what we're doing. We are not going to take glory. We are not going to boast of another man's labors. Now, Paul spoke to the church at Corinth. Let's turn back. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. I want to make sure that we understand this is not conflicting thoughts that he's saying here. Paul did not have a problem considering fellow servants of Christ as his co-laborers. He considered himself a worker and was happy and content to work with others. He didn't even mind working in the same field. He didn't even mind working in the same spot as others. He mentions here in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, when one would say, I'm of Paul, or another, I'm of Apollos, he said, are you not carnal? Verse 5, 1 Corinthians 3:5, who then is Paul, and who is Apollos, but ministers by whom ye believed, even as the Lord gave to every man? I've planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then, neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase. Now, he that planteth and he that watereth are one, and every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor. For we are laborers together with God. Ye are God's husbandry, ye are God's building. According to the grace of God which is given unto me as a wise master builder, I've laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But let every man take heed how he buildeth thereon. Paul is not a glory hog. Paul did not mind sharing the same field with people. And if I planted and another watered and God gives the increase, That's great. That's wonderful. We work together. I'm not anything. Apollos isn't anything. We work together. We work to serve. Yes, I've laid the foundation, but because there's no other foundation, as long as another man's coming in and he's not trying to lay another foundation, as long as he's building upon the true foundation, he said that's fine. And Paul encouraged people to work together. He said, ye are laborers together. But what Paul does have a problem with are those that would come in behind another man and try to take glory for the work and efforts of another person. And that's what he's getting at there in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. You see, you read 1 Corinthians 3 and you read about how Paul would call, people co-laborers, working together, building on the same foundation. But then he comes over in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and he says, we're not going to boast of another man's labors. Paul is not going to boast or try to find glory in the successes of others. Yes, we work together. But Paul is not going to be a hotshot and come in and act like every success everywhere is always him. And it's really silly for the people at Corinth to come in after Paul had laid such a good foundation, after Paul introduced the gospel to them, for these people to come along later and contradict him and assassinate his character and act like they were responsible for the work at Corinth. Now, Paul is going to remind us many times in 2 Corinthians that it's a fool who glories. It's foolish to boast. But he often says, hey, please forgive me, but I am going to boast a little bit here. And he's going to remind them of the work that he did. And these people that came by after him, and for lack of a better term, would like to take all the credit, Paul's like, that's obnoxious. Don't act like I didn't come there. Don't act like I wasn't there laying the foundation and bringing the gospel to you. We're not going to act that way. We are not going to do that in verse 15. We are not going to boast of things without our measure of other men's labors. Right? We are not going to I'm just kind of thinking back and I roll through, memory lane here. It's hard, I think, especially of like young preachers that, maybe you've got a church, you got the church with the established pastor, and then you've got the young pastor that comes along, and the first time he gets his opportunity, there's a temptation there for great pride, to feel like you've arrived, to feel like you're a big shot, right? That there's danger in that. That's why Paul warns that the office of a bishop should not quickly be entered by a novice, should not be entered by one who has not been trained, and has not been seasoned, who's not had any experience at all. Paul says we're not doing this. Don't act like I didn't come there. Don't act like I didn't bring the gospel to you. Now, I'm not going to boast of another man's labors. Don't let anybody else boast of mine. We came, we brought you the gospel. Verse 15. And here was our hope. He says, but having this hope, when your faith is increased, that we shall be enlarged by you, according to our rule, abundantly. We work together, and I'm not going to intrude into another man's work and claim his successes. But the rest of this verse is convicting, because you would hope that Corinth by now, because Paul had come, because he had written letters, you would hope that Corinth would mature and grow so that sphere of influence now could even be enlarged, right? Here's our hope, that when your faith is increased, that we shall be enlarged by you. It's quite possible that the sphere of Paul's influence was dulled or blunted. You say, why so? Look at how much time he has to devote to Corinth. Here's a church that he established. Here's a group of people that he prepared and got ready for the work and preaching the gospel to them and laying a good foundation and teaching them. How much of Paul's ministry is later spent going back and continuing to fix things? How much more of a sphere of influence could Paul have had? How much more of a sphere of influence could Paul have reached if he didn't have to spend so much time with Corinth? I pray you get these things figured out. Your faith needs to increase. You need to grow so that that circle gets larger. The preacher should not, and I can even say this on behalf of Brother John, he shouldn't always have to fix problems. The ministry should not just be about fixing people's problems. He's happy to do so. He doesn't complain about those things, and I think if he had complaints, he'd probably keep them to himself and pray about them instead of telling us anyway. But we as a church should make sure, much like Corinth should have, that, if he's got a calling and he's got a job and he's got efforts that he's putting forth to do things, if we become too much of a distraction, that sphere is not expanding and growing to the degree maybe that it ought to, or that he wants it to. And that's what Paul is saying here in part. Your faith needs to increase so that we can be enlarged. Again, he's not a glory hog, but he knows with the calling that he has, with the duty that he has, with the influence that he's trying to have, he could certainly have a lot more if Corinth would get their act together and he could move on to something else. And that's blunt, but sometimes he had to be. If they would grow, if they would get it fixed, he could move on to something else. What is that? Well, verse 16 tells us, to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you. Not to boast in another man's line of things made ready to our hand. That is the goal, to publish the gospel in the regions beyond and the regions beyond you. Paul's not going to waste time. He's not going to waste time boasting in another sphere of accomplishment. He has his own sphere. He would like it to grow. Even Paul, the apostle, even one who did as much as he did, here in these verses, he talks about that. He talks about himself even being enlarged. Every preacher wants to have an influence. He doesn't want to see that dulled. He doesn't want to see that stunted. None of us want to see any of that development stunted. So Corinth needs to grow. Corinth needs to get this right. Paul has a ministry. And to anybody that would say that, Peter or another church or anyone within the church at Corinth, that they are the measuring stick, Paul says, I don't have time to mess with that. I only have time to mess with the sphere of work that God has given me. I'd like it to be bigger if you'd get some of this stuff fixed, and I don't have to mess with you all the time. But I've got my own stuff to worry about. I can't worry about measuring up to you. I can't worry about what you think all the time. Romans chapter 15. Now, lest you think he's just being mean to the church at Corinth with that, let's see what he told the Romans. Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15, verse 14. And I myself also am persuaded of you, my brethren, that ye also are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, able also to admonish one another. Nevertheless, brethren, I've written the more boldly unto you in some sort, as putting you in mind because of the grace that is given to me of God, that I should be the minister of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles, ministering the gospel of God, that the offering up of the Gentiles might be acceptable, being sanctified by the Holy Ghost. I have therefore, whereof I may glory through Jesus Christ in those things which pertain to God. For I will not dare to speak of any of those things which Christ hath not wrought by me. That's just what he told Corinth. I'm not going to glory in the work of another. But he does say here, I will not dare to speak of any of those things which Christ hath not wrought by me, to make the Gentiles obedient by word and deed, through mighty signs and wonders by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and round about unto Illyricum, I have fully preached the gospel of Christ. Yea, so have I strived to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest I should build upon another's foundation. Paul knew, and he's mentioned it now multiple times, I have a calling and a sphere of influence that I have to be busy about. And I can't worry about boasting about what other people are doing. I can't worry about all the things that are beyond my control and my own sphere. And when we as individuals, or even we as a church, if we grasp that our measuring stick is not what everyone else is accomplishing, okay? Brother John's measuring stick is not another preacher. It's not another pastor. Okay, that is not how we measure him. We don't line him up with preachers and try to see, okay, well, he's better than these guys and maybe not as good. That's not what we're about. That's not how we're doing this, Paul said. So how are we going to do that? Well, that's the last point. Let's look at Paul's real measuring stick. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse number 17, but he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. Now that is a quote from Jeremiah chapter 9. And he that glorieth, let him glory in this. And he's not going to glory in wisdom. And he's not going to glory in knowledge. He's going to glory in the Lord. He's going to glory in God. In quoting this, Paul is able to rebuke those who found their glory in Paul, maybe those who found their glory against Paul. They found in every way that they were measuring themselves against Paul. Paul's not the measuring stick. Paul could say to Corinth, you're not my measuring stick, and honestly, I'm not yours. Him that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. You do not stand or fall. Success and failure is not a matter of whether or not you measure up to me. It's not a matter of whether I measure up to you. Verse 18, for not he that commendeth himself is approved, but whom the Lord commendeth. Self-commendation is not what wins God's approval. Now there are some wise words in the book of Proverbs about this. In Proverbs chapter 25, Proverbs chapter 25, verse 27, it says this. Proverbs 25, verse 27, it is not good to eat much honey, so for men to search their own glory is not glory. Think on that. For men to search their own glory is not glory. Now, just over a couple chapters in Proverbs 27, verse 2, another familiar verse. Proverbs 27, verse 2, let another man praise thee, and not thine own mouth, a stranger, and not thine own lips. Commendation or self-promotion is not what wins God's approval. We don't have to spend a lot of time puffing up ourselves and making sure that everybody knows all that we've done and all that we're doing. I don't have to measure myself against you. You don't have to measure yourself against me. And I don't have to spend my entire life proving myself to you. And you don't have to spend your entire life proving yourself or trying to convince me. Here's what he says. He that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. For not he that commendeth himself is approved, but whom the Lord commendeth. Do you know what ministries and ministers are successful? The ones the Lord uses. The one the Lord does work through. And you can't fake that, and you can't talk yourself into that, and you can't self-promote that. Those that find success are those whom the Lord commendeth. Paul judged that differently than so many others. Paul was not he obviously loved Corinth. He wanted Corinth to get these things fixed so that he could move on to more important matters and enlarge that sphere of influence. But to these that have accused him, Paul is basically just in these last verses told them, I don't care what you think. You're not you're not the measuring stick. The measuring stick of a successful ministry is the one that has the stamp of approval of the Lord. Not these people at Corinth, not the accusers, not the backbiters, not the ones that had come and challenged his apostleship. Paul says if it's been commended by the Lord, it's a good work. And he already told us earlier in this book that he considered Corinth a successful ministry. How did he do so? He says, if you think that I'm looking for letters of commendation, you are the letters. Paul reminds them of the work that God did through him when he came to Corinth. That speaks for itself. The work that God did in Corinth speaks for itself. And he doesn't have to have Corinth commend him, and he doesn't need letters of commendation. He doesn't have to compare himself against anyone. God has given evidence of this work, Paul would say. And therefore it's successful. Now, to our church, as we close, I know we haven't covered very many verses tonight, but that's okay. How are we going to determine success and failure in personal service? Well, if we spend a lot of time comparing ourselves with each other, he says that's not wise. Because eventually I'm going to get tired of that, and I'm going to only compare myself against people that don't do as much as I do, people that I determine to be less spiritual. Very rarely would I compare myself against someone that's more spiritual or who does more. So that's a waste of time. Paul says that's foolishness. We're going to close our focus. We're going to close our focus to that which is within our measure. We are going to keep our focus on the job at hand, to the sphere of influence that God has given us. Now, I pray, and we cooperate. We have sister churches. We have friendly churches that we love, we support. We would help financially if they needed it, and they've helped us financially when we have needed it. We have supporting churches. But listen, I can't do anything about Middlefield, Ohio, Dover, Tennessee, Detroit, Michigan, or Warren, Michigan. That's not our sphere of influence. We cannot judge ourselves in light of what's going on in these other places. God has given us a sphere of work here. We have to determine to set our focus toward that work. Whether or not that is a success is given to us here, not based on what people think of it. Does the Lord put his stamp of approval on what we're doing? Are we being faithful to God's word? Are we preaching the Bible? Are we trying to be faithful to the scriptures? As we have opportunity, obviously we want to, in God's house, we want to teach, we want to preach to folks and teach them the truth. Are we being faithful witnesses for him? Are we trying to share the gospel with those that are around us? We have been given measures of success. We have been given the yardstick, but whereby to measure whether or not we're on the right path or not. It's not in comparing ourselves with each other or with other churches or with any other ministry. Stop worrying about what the church down the road is doing, what they have versus what we have and what we're doing here. Focus to the things that are within our measure. Stop worrying about another person's successes and boasting of those. Let's just do our job. Let's just do our work. That would occupy enough of our time, right? All right. That's it. Let's go ahead and quit.